Marcus thought he had nothing left to lose when he took his brother's life in a fit of righteous rage. But the real betrayal wasn't what he imagined. Hidden in a dusty drawer, a signed contract revealed a horrifying truth. His brother took the blame to protect Marcus, and now the ones who demanded that loyalty are back to collect. Blood is already spilling, and Marcus has just become their next target. The prison gates groaned as they opened, metal against metal, a sound Marcus had imagined in his sleep for years. But the freedom he had once dreamed of no longer felt like liberation. It felt like stepping into a colder, crueler world, one that had kept turning without him, one where every familiar face had blurred into suspicion, and every memory had curdled into betrayal. He carried nothing but a plastic bag of old clothes and a rage so deeply rooted it had replaced the hunger for hope. The morning was heavy with gray mist as he walked toward the bus station, the asphalt underfoot cracked and forgotten, like the path of his life. No one waited for him, no one welcomed him, and he preferred it that way. He had made peace with solitude inside those concrete walls. What he could not forgive was what his brother Jason had done. 10 years ago, Jason had stood in court, pale but composed, a living dagger in Marcus's side as he testified to save himself, to cut loose the dead weight of a brother sinking into a life they could no longer share, or so Marcus had believed. Every year spent behind bars added a new layer to the story he told himself. Jason's betrayal was deliberate, cruel, calculated. And when the parole board had finally stamped their approval, Marcus didn't think about starting fresh. He thought about retribution. The old neighborhood had changed. Gentrified storefronts stood where graffiti-smeared diners once huddled. Faces were younger, cleaner, more cautious. But the house was still there. A squat, peeling two-story place tucked into the corner of a weedy lot, pretending to stand proud while rot spread quietly through its bones. Marcus watched it from across the street, hidden under the hood of his borrowed jacket. Curtains were drawn. A light flickered weakly behind the grimy windows. Jason was home. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. Years of confinement had sharpened his hatred into something disciplined, almost clinical. This wasn't about rage. Rage was messy. This was about balance, restoration, an eye for an eye, or maybe more. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind, sharpening it like a blade against stone, stripping away the doubts that had once made him weak. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic shouting match. Jason didn't deserve a warning. He deserved to feel, in his last moments, the same sense of helpless betrayal Marcus had lived with every single day. Night fell slowly, dragging shadows over the streets like a shroud. Marcus waited, a silent silhouette against the dying light. Patience had become his second nature. He watched the habits of the house, the flicker of a television screen against the curtains, the occasional silhouette crossing the room. Jason alone, living a quiet life he had stolen. Marcus felt no pity, no hesitation, only the grinding certainty that he was restoring the broken order of things. Hours passed. The street emptied, the last dog walker vanishing into the maze of alleys. Only then did Marcus move, crossing the road with the deliberate mechanical grace of a man whose decision had already been made. His hand slid inside his jacket, fingers brushing cold metal. Not a weapon, not tonight, but something heavier, the symbolic weight of consequence. What he intended was simple, brutal, final. Inside the house, Jason would be unsuspecting. Maybe asleep, maybe drunk. It didn't matter. Marcus knew how to make it quick. Years behind bars taught him many things: how to be invisible, how to strike. Without hesitation, how to erase yourself before anyone could even raise an alarm. The front door would be locked, but locks were only obstacles for those who feared consequences. Marcus felt nothing but the tight burn of inevitability in his chest as he approached the porch, the creak of the old wood hidden beneath the noise of his heartbeat. The plan was flawless because it had been forged in the purest furnace of betrayal. In Marcus's mind, Jason had already paid the price, he just didn't know it yet. All that remained was to make reality catch up to memory. The key was still hidden under the loose brick. Some things never changed even when everything else did. Marcus pried it free with cold fingers, inserted it into the lock, and turned. The soft click echoed louder in his mind than it did in the air. He opened the door and stepped inside. The house smelled of dust and something older, something like regret. Marcus moved silently through the hallway, toward the faint sound of breathing that came from the back room. His body acted without thought now, a machine set into motion by years of hatred. He wasn't sure if Jason stirred, if some ancient bond warned him of the danger approaching. It didn't matter. Marcus stood over the figure on the couch. In the half-light, Jason's face looked smaller than he remembered, softer, worn by years of quiet survival. For a split second, Marcus hesitated. A flicker of something, memory, guilt, confusion, licked at the edges of his anger. But it was too late for hesitation. He had crossed too many lines already. The silence of the house swallowed the violence whole. When it was over, Marcus stood breathing heavily, his hands trembling slightly, his body flooded not with satisfaction but with an unfamiliar emptiness. The world outside continued unchanged. No alarms, no sirens. Just the faint buzz of a broken street lamp and the distant hum of a train moving through the night. Marcus left the house the same way he had entered, unnoticed, unseen, unremarkable. Only now he carried more than the weight of years lost. He carried a new emptiness, one that gnawed more viciously than the hunger for revenge ever had. He told himself it was over, that justice had been served, that he was finally free. But somewhere deep inside, buried beneath the years of anger, a sliver of unease twisted like a knife in the dark. And the house behind him, the house he left, broken and bloodstained, held a truth he was not yet ready to face. The city barely stirred in the early hours, wrapped in a heavy mist that blurred the streetlights into pale, flickering ghosts. Marcus walked aimlessly through deserted alleys, the adrenaline from what he had done refusing to drain from his veins. Every step he took away from the house felt heavier, like the night itself was trying to pull him back toward the bloody truth he left behind. He could still feel the tremor in his hands, the slight catch in his breath, the phantom weight of Jason's last heartbeat breaking against his skin. He had imagined this moment for years, the triumph, the closure. But the air felt empty, as if something crucial had been ripped away rather than restored. He found himself wandering into the industrial side of town, a graveyard of old warehouses and crumbling loading docks. Here no one would notice a man with guilt bleeding from his pores. He sank onto the broken steps of an abandoned factory, pressing his palms into his face, feeling the roughness of his unshaved beard against trembling fingers. The silence of the place was deafening, a roar of everything he didn't want to hear. He told himself he had no regrets. Jason deserved it. Betrayal deserved no mercy. And yet the seed of doubt had already been planted, deep and insidious. Marcus tried to crush it with memories. Jason laughing while Marcus was led away in cuffs. Jason living free while Marcus rotted behind bars. He fed the fire with old bitterness, with every unanswered letter, every broken promise. But emotions, once unleashed, had a way of twisting back on themselves. Somewhere between the second and third cigarette he smoked down to the filter, Marcus realized he hadn't thought about what came next. There was no plan beyond revenge. He hadn't envisioned a future for himself after Jason was gone. All he could do now was survive in a city that had forgotten him. The sky began to pale in the east, the mist thinning into low-lying banks of fog as the world crept back to life. Garbage trucks rumbled down main roads. Neon signs blinked awake in greasy diners. Marcus pulled his hood up and moved again, shoulders hunched, head down. He needed to disappear for a while. Blood didn't just vanish. Someone would come looking. Even in a city like this, someone always asked questions eventually. He made his way to a rundown motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where cash spoke louder than ID. The clerk barely looked up as Marcus slid a crumpled bill across the counter. Room 6 smelled of mildew and stale smoke, but it offered anonymity, and that was all he cared about. He locked the door, wedged a chair under the knob, and collapsed onto the squeaky bed. His mind refused to shut down. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jason's face, not in anger or betrayal, but in something closer to confusion, as if he had expected someone else to deliver the final blow. Marcus woke hours later, disoriented and raw. He drifted through the day in a haze, holed up in the tiny room watching the news through the static of the battered television set. No headlines screamed of murder yet, no images of Jason's house. Maybe no one had found him. Maybe it would take days, maybe weeks. He told himself he didn't care. By the third day, Marcus grew restless. Paranoia sharpened every sound: footsteps in the hall, the rattle of cleaning carts, the distant bark of a dog. He left the motel at night, moving like a ghost through side streets and back alleys, avoiding surveillance cameras and well-lit avenues. He thought about leaving town entirely, but something held him back, something unfinished. The dream started soon after. Jason appearing in the corner of the room, standing silently by the door, blood dripping from his mouth, staring at Marcus, with eyes full of sorrow and something worse, forgiveness. Marcus would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the shadows of the room twisting into accusatory shapes. He stopped sleeping altogether. On the sixth night, unable to bear the isolation, Marcus returned to Jason's house. Rationality told him it was madness, but a deeper instinct drove him back. He needed to erase traces, needed to see, needed to be sure. The neighborhood was even quieter now. The houses shuddered against the creeping autumn chill. No police tape adorned the door. No flashing lights. The house stood as it always had, weary, broken, hiding its secrets behind dirty windows. Marcus crept around the back, his steps muffled on the overgrown grass. He found the spare key still hidden where he left it. Every creak of the floorboards inside sounded deafening. He moved carefully, avoiding the blood-stained carpet in the living room where Jason had fallen. His heart pounded as he checked every room, every corner. Nothing had changed, no sign of intrusion, no sign of discovery. It was then, standing in Jason's bedroom, that he noticed the drawer. A small, battered desk sat under the window, half buried in dust and clutter. The drawer was partially open, as if disturbed in haste or forgotten in fear. Something inside glinted faintly in the moonlight. Marcus approached it, his gut twisting tighter with each step. Inside the drawer was a stack of papers, brittle with age, yellowed at the edges. On top lay an envelope addressed not to Jason but to Marcus himself, in a handwriting he recognized immediately: careful, heavy, sincere. With trembling fingers, Marcus pulled out the envelope and opened it, and the world he thought he understood began to collapse. The envelope trembled in Marcus's hands, the old paper brittle against his fingers as he pulled out its contents. Inside were two items: a single-page letter and a folded document, yellowed and worn, bearing an official seal Marcus did not immediately recognize. The letter, written in Jason's heavy, familiar hand, was short. Just a few sentences, but they punched harder than any fist Marcus had ever taken. Jason had not betrayed him. Jason had protected him. Marcus sat down heavily on the dusty floor, the room spinning around him in slow, nauseating circles. He read the letter again and again, each word dragging him deeper into a realization he had not prepared for. Jason had made a deal. 10 years ago, when Marcus had been caught up in a web of crimes he only half understood, Jason had stepped forward. He had confessed to things he hadn't done, signed statements that weren't his, all to ensure Marcus would be spared from people far worse than the system they both despised. Marcus hadn't just been imprisoned because of Jason's testimony. He had been saved from something worse, something Jason had tried to shield him from. The second document explained it more clearly, though the legal language was cold and hard to process. It was a contract of sorts, drafted by men who had operated far beyond the reach of law enforcement. Jason had agreed to take the fall for a failed job tied to organized crime, to claim full responsibility and serve time, in exchange for the safety of Marcus and the rest of their fractured family. It was signed by names Marcus didn't recognize, but one signature stood out: a symbol rather than a name, etched in sharp, deliberate strokes that made Marcus's skin crawl just looking at it. He sat there for what felt like hours, the letter hanging loosely from his fingers, the old wood floor cold against his legs, the anger he had nourished for years, the hatred that had sustained him through endless nights in prison, now crumbled into something far uglier. Guilt. It lodged in his throat, burned behind his eyes. Jason had not just been innocent. He had been a shield, a sacrifice. Marcus's mind reeled backward, clawing through memories he had buried, looking for signs he had missed. The hurried way Jason had hugged him before the trial, the strange hollow look in his eyes when they parted for the last time, the unanswered letters, not because Jason had abandoned him, but perhaps because he had been told to stay silent. Had Marcus even tried to understand? Had he wanted to? The house felt different now. He could almost hear the ghost of Jason moving through the rooms, living a half-life built on pain and secrecy. The photographs on the walls took on new meaning. Jason alone at family gatherings, Jason smiling thinly at birthdays, Jason aging quietly under the weight of a secret too heavy to share. Marcus stuffed the letter and the contract into his jacket and stumbled outside, the cold night air slapping him hard across the face. He couldn't breathe inside that house anymore. His boots scraped against the sidewalk as he wandered aimlessly, not knowing where he was going, only that he couldn't stay still. The city around him blurred into faceless shapes and muted sounds. Somewhere deep inside, something was breaking apart, the last remnants of the story he had told himself to survive. He found himself at the edge of the park where they used to play as kids, the old swings rusted and swaying gently in the night breeze. He sat on a bench, hunched forward, clutching the papers like a lifeline he couldn't bear to let go of. The contract felt like poison against his skin, the seal mocking him with every glance. If Jason had taken the fall willingly, if he had sacrificed everything to protect Marcus, then why was he now dead by Marcus's own hand? The betrayal wasn't Jason's, it was Marcus's. He had killed the only person who had ever truly tried to save him, but the nightmare wasn't finished. Marcus pulled the papers out again, scanning the bottom of the contract. There was a clause, a chilling line that sent a fresh surge of ice through his veins. If Jason failed to fulfill his end of the bargain, or if he compromised the secrecy of the arrangement, retribution would not stop with him. It would extend to everyone he loved, everyone connected. Marcus crumpled the papers in his fists, his pulse thundering in his ears. Killing Jason had not broken the chain. It had activated it. He understood now that his family was not safe. He wasn't safe. The people Jason had protected them from weren't gone. They were patient. They were calculating. And they were still watching. The feeling of being hunted pressed against Marcus's spine, a cold weight he couldn't shake. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, sharp, urgent, and he flinched, scanning the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move. Every whisper of wind sounded like a footstep. The past was not finished with him. Jason's death had not closed a chapter. It had opened a door, and something had already stepped through. The world no longer looked the same to Marcus. Every familiar street corner, every dimly lit alley, every stranger's glance carried a new and heavier weight. He moved like a man untethered, drifting through the city's decaying veins, the contract burning against his chest with each heartbeat. It had been 2 days since he discovered the truth about Jason's sacrifice, but time had lost all meaning, slipping past him in a gray, smothering blur. The streets, once merely indifferent, now felt hostile, as if invisible eyes tracked him from every shadow. Marcus knew paranoia when he saw it, had lived among the truly paranoid behind concrete walls. But this felt different. This wasn't imagination. This was a warning. He spent hours walking, retracing Jason's steps in his mind, trying to assemble a puzzle made of broken pieces. Jason had made a deal, but with whom exactly? The names on the contract meant nothing to Marcus, just a collection of unfamiliar signatures beneath a chilling emblem. The jagged symbol that looked like a brand burned into the paper itself. He needed answers. He needed to understand what Jason had been protecting them from, and why the danger had returned now, so merciless and silent. Late one night, Marcus returned to the house he once called home. It stood abandoned, untouched since he fled, a hollow shell that seemed to sag heavier under the weight of its secrets. He crept through the broken back fence, the board splitting under his boots, and entered through the basement door. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp wood and old regrets. He moved methodically, searching every drawer, every loose floorboard, every hidden nook Jason might have used to stash more evidence. The answers had to be here. In the basement, buried beneath old paint cans and crumbling boxes, he found a metal safe no larger than a bread box. The lock was rusted, but Marcus pried it open with a crowbar, his hands blistered and trembling. Inside, he found a thin stack of folders, brittle with age, and a small black notebook with Jason's name scratched inside the cover. He sat on the cold concrete floor and began to read. The notes were chaotic but detailed, a fractured journal chronicling Jason's descent into fear and desperation. Jason wrote about the men who had orchestrated the deal, a network of criminals and ex-law enforcement officers who operated beyond the reach of any court. They called themselves the Circle, an innocuous name that masked their brutal methods. They didn't forgive mistakes. They didn't tolerate betrayal. When Jason agreed to take the fall for a crime Marcus had unknowingly been pulled into, the Circle guaranteed the family's safety, but only as long as Jason kept silent and served his time without protest. Marcus's stomach twisted with every page. Jason had endured years of blackmail, threats, and sleepless nights, all while pretending life was normal. The letters he never sent, the family gatherings he never missed, every laugh, every smile, every ordinary moment had been a shield masking the constant terror of retribution. Marcus saw now that Jason hadn't just been protecting him. He had been buying time with every breath he took. But something had changed. Toward the end of the notebook, Jason's entries became frantic, almost illegible. He spoke of feeling watched, of late-night calls with no voice on the other end, of cars idling outside his home at strange hours. He wrote about a warning he received. A message slipped under his door. "Your time is running out." Marcus closed the notebook, his chest hollow with dread. Killing Jason hadn't satisfied some twisted code of honor. It had broken the last thin thread holding the Circle's rage at bay. Without Jason to bear the burden, the debt was active again, and Marcus was now its primary target. As if summoned by his realization, a sound shattered the silence upstairs, a soft creak of a floorboard, unmistakable in the dead air of the abandoned house. Marcus froze, every nerve electrified. Someone was here. He tucked the notebook inside his jacket and slipped into the shadows along the basement wall, his breath shallow and silent, footsteps above, slow and measured. Not a neighbor, not a looter. Someone searching. The basement offered no exits except the door he had entered through. Marcus moved like a phantom, slipping up the stairs just far enough to see a sliver of the hallway. A figure stood silhouetted in the entryway, tall and still, the faint gleam of something metallic in their hand. Marcus's mind raced. Was it a weapon? A phone? A badge? Whoever they were, they hadn't come for conversation. Adrenaline surged through him, clearing the fog of grief and guilt in an instant. He retreated silently back into the basement, groping in the dark until his fingers brushed against a rusted old pipe. It wasn't much, but it was something. He gripped it tightly, muscles coiled, heart hammering. Minutes passed like lifetimes. The footsteps receded, then returned, pacing the floor above as if the intruder was thinking, calculating. Marcus waited, every muscle trembling with the urge to move, to fight, to survive. Finally, after what felt like hours, the footsteps withdrew. A soft click as the front door closed, a car engine rumbling to life, then fading into the distance. Marcus didn't move for a long time. When he finally emerged, the street was empty, the house silent once again. But he knew better now. They were watching. They had found him, The circle hadn't forgotten. They hadn't forgiven, and they were just getting started. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in a plastic chair stolen from the abandoned house's kitchen, the notebook clutched tightly in his lap, eyes flicking toward the door at every groan of the wind. The sense of being hunted clung to him like a second skin now, a heavy, suffocating presence that filled every room he entered. He knew the men who had been loyal to the circle were patient, methodical. They wouldn't rush. They would bleed him dry by taking away everything and everyone he had left, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell begging for an end. By morning, Marcus made the only decision he could. He had to warn the others. His family had no idea that the silent war Jason had fought for years was now spilling out into their lives, violent and unstoppable. If the circle had started hunting again, no one was safe. His mother, his sister, the few friends who had stayed loyal during his prison years, all of them were potential targets, and it would be his fault if they fell. He didn't bother with his old phone. It was probably already compromised. Instead, he used payphones, changing locations every few hours, speaking in clipped, coded sentences that barely scratched the surface of the danger closing in. Some didn't pick up. Some hung up in confusion or fear. A few cursed him, old grudges boiling over now that he had resurfaced from the graveyard of the forgotten. But a handful listened. A handful understood that the past had claws that were still sharp and hungry. The first strike came faster than he expected. 2 nights later, Marcus sat hidden in a beat-up sedan across from his sister's apartment, nerves fraying with every minute that ticked by. He had told her to pack a bag, to be ready, but when the black SUV pulled up to the curb and 2 men in dark clothing emerged, he realized too late that he had underestimated their boldness. He barely had time to react before they were at her door, lockpicks flashing in the low light. Marcus moved on instinct, wrenching the car door open and sprinting across the street, heart hammering against his ribs. He shouted her name, the sound tearing through the quiet like a gunshot. Lights flickered on in neighboring windows. Dogs barked. Somewhere a siren wailed, but it was enough. The men hesitated, glancing back toward him, and in that hesitation, his sister burst through the front door, barefoot and screaming, clutching a crying toddler to her chest. The men retreated, slipping into the SUV and disappearing into the night before Marcus could even get a license plate. He held his sister for a long time afterward, both of them shaking, both understanding without words that this was only the beginning. They couldn't go back to their old lives. Not now. Not ever. Word spread quickly among the few who mattered. Those Marcus had warned started disappearing, going off-grid in ways that spoke of old training, old habits rekindled by fear. But not everyone moved fast enough. The next body turned up 3 days later, a cousin Marcus barely remembered from childhood, found in an alley with a broken neck and no witnesses. Then another, a former friend, once a lookout for a job Marcus had long forgotten, now just another news headline drowned in blood. Marcus realized with grim certainty that the circle wasn't just tying up loose ends. They were sending a message. No one who had touched the original deal would be allowed to survive. No debts would remain unpaid. Their ruthlessness hadn't softened with time. If anything, it had sharpened, become something colder and more precise. He started sleeping in abandoned buildings again, moving each night, trusting no one. He taught his sister how to change cars, how to check for tails, how to hide a weapon in plain sight. They became shadows within shadows, surviving on adrenaline, and the faint hope that staying invisible might be enough. It wasn't. One night, returning from a supply run, Marcus found the safe house ransacked, doors broken open, furniture overturned, blood smeared in a hasty, chaotic pattern along the walls. His sister and nephew were gone. A single message was left behind, scrawled on the cracked bathroom mirror in thick black marker. He paid. You will too. The words twisted in Marcus's gut like a blade. He knew then that the time for running had ended. The circle wasn't going to stop until he was dead, and everyone he cared about was dust in their wake. They had made a mistake, though. They thought they were hunting the same broken man who had stumbled out of prison, lost and blind with rage. But Marcus had changed. The guilt had burned the last traces of hesitation from him. The notebook Jason left behind had armed him with knowledge, and the blood staining his hands had hardened him against pity. The hunters had become the hunted, and Marcus was going to make them bleed. Marcus moved through the city like a ghost now, slipping between its broken cracks and poisoned alleys, his mind razor-sharp with purpose. There was no fear left in him, only cold inevitability. The circle had taken everything. They had ripped apart the fragile remnants of his family, shredded the thin walls Jason had died trying to hold together. They believed they had won, that Marcus would crawl into the same hole Jason had been forced to occupy for years, silent and obedient until the end. They didn't understand yet that Marcus Carter had no intention of dying quietly. He started with what he knew, the old contacts, the faded connections to the world Jason had once lived in fear of. Marcus traced the names from the contract, the ones Jason had scribbled frantic notes about in the black notebook. They weren't just criminals, they were architects of ruin, ex-cops, syndicate leaders, government men who had long since traded conscience for survival. Men who had worn suits by day and wielded blood by night. It took days of stalking, of setting traps and watching from the shadows, before Marcus found the first crack. A mid-level enforcer named Blake Turner, a man whose arrogance had grown larger than his caution, boasting in the wrong bar to the wrong woman. Marcus followed him for 3 nights, learning his patterns, waiting for the moment he was alone, vulnerable. When it came, Marcus moved without hesitation. The confrontation was brutal, short, and final. Turner gasped out Jason's name with his last breath, as if even death couldn't erase the shame of what they had done. But the information Marcus pried from Turner before the end was worth every bloody second. The circle wasn't just one web. It was many. Layers within layers. Factions vying for control, feeding off fear and silence. Jason had made his deal with only one branch, thinking he could contain the rot. He hadn't known that by stepping into the darkness, he had invited it to grow. And at the heart of it all, the true architect of the nightmare Marcus's family now lived. A name Jason had never written down, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because he couldn't bear to acknowledge the betrayal. Leon Vance. It wasn't. One night, returning from a supply run, Marcus found the safe house ransacked. Doors broken open, furniture overturned, blood smeared in a hasty, chaotic pattern along the walls. His sister and nephew were gone. A single message was left behind, scrawled on the cracked bathroom mirror in thick black marker. He paid. You will too. The words twisted in Marcus's gut like a blade. He knew then that the time for running had ended. The circle wasn't going to stop until he was dead, and everyone he cared about was dust in their wake. They had made a mistake, though. They thought they were hunting the same broken man who had stumbled out of prison, lost and blind with rage. But Marcus had changed. The guilt had burned the last traces of hesitation from him. The notebook Jason left behind had armed him with knowledge, and the blood staining his hands had hardened him against pity. The hunters had become the hunted, and Marcus was going to make them bleed. Marcus moved through the city like a ghost now, slipping between its broken cracks and poisoned alleys, his mind razor-sharp with purpose. There was no fear left in him, only cold inevitability. The circle had taken everything. They had ripped apart the fragile remnants of his family, shredded the thin walls Jason had died trying to hold together. They believed they had won, that Marcus would crawl into the same hole Jason had been forced to occupy for years, silent and obedient until the end. They didn't understand yet that Marcus Carter had no intention of dying quietly. He started with what he knew, the old contacts, the faded connections to the world Jason had once lived in fear of. Marcus traced the names from the contract, the ones Jason had scribbled frantic notes about in the black notebook. They weren't just criminals. They were architects of ruin, ex-cops, syndicate leaders, government men who had long since traded conscience for survival, men who had worn suits by day and wielded blood by night. It took days of stalking, of setting traps and watching from the shadows, before Marcus found the first crack. a mid-level enforcer named Blake Turner, a man whose arrogance had grown larger than his caution. Boasting in the wrong bar to the wrong woman, Marcus followed him for 3 nights, learning his patterns, waiting for the moment he was alone, vulnerable. When it came, Marcus moved without hesitation. The confrontation was brutal, short, and final. Turner gasped out Jason's name with his last breath, as if even death couldn't erase the shame of what they had done. But the information Marcus pried from Turner before the end was worth every bloody second. The circle wasn't just one web, it was many. Layers within layers, factions vying for control, feeding off fear and silence. Jason had made his deal with only one branch, thinking he could contain the rot. He hadn't known that by stepping into the darkness, he had invited it to grow. And at the heart of it all, the true architect of the nightmare Marcus's family now lived. A name Jason had never written down, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because he couldn't bear to acknowledge the betrayal. Leon Vance. It was almost laughable. Vance had been a family friend once, a mentor figure to both brothers when they were young and stupid and eager to carve out their piece of the world. He had taught them how to fight, how to survive, how to navigate the streets without becoming victims. Marcus had admired him once, called him uncle even though there was no blood between them. It had been Vance who first offered Jason the deal, convincing him that taking the blame was the only way to protect Marcus and everyone they loved. And all the while, Vance had been the one orchestrating it all, profiting from their pain. The Kaitier betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that Marcus felt hollow as he processed it. Jason had never stood a chance. Neither had he. They had both been pawns from the start, used to cover Vance's bloody footprints, sacrificed to protect the empire he built out of fear and silence. Marcus knew then what he had to do. Vance wasn't just another target. He was the end of the harness. The poison that had spread through their lives had a source, and Marcus was going to cut it out. It wasn't easy. Vance was a ghost even among shadows, protected by layers of security, alliances of convenience, and the simple fear that kept weaker men from daring to oppose him. But Marcus had nothing left to lose. He used everything Jason had left behind: the hidden contacts, the coded addresses, the whispered rumors passed in dark alleys. Slowly he closed the distance between them. It ended in a crumbling mansion on the outskirts of the city, a relic of another age, its grandeur faded and rotting. Much like the man inside, Marcus breached the perimeter under cover of night, dispatching guards with brutal efficiency. Every step forward felt like walking through Jason's memories, through the broken promises and stolen futures that Vance had left behind. When Marcus finally stood in the ruined parlor, facing the man who had destroyed everything he loved, he expected rage to consume him. Instead, he felt only a strange, hollow calm. Vance looked older than Marcus remembered, the weight of years and sins etched deep into his face. For a moment, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. No apologies that could mend what had been broken. No explanations that could justify the graves now filled because of his ambition. The confrontation was swift and inevitable. Marcus made sure it was final. When it was over, Marcus stood alone amid the wreckage, the stench of blood and decay heavy in the air. The mansion burned behind him as he walked away, its flames clawing at the sky like desperate hands. In the distance, he could almost hear Jason's voice, not in anger or sorrow, but in a strange, sad kind of peace. The circle would fracture now. Without Vance, the empire would eat itself alive, torn apart by greed and paranoia. Marcus had no illusions that the world would suddenly become a better place. The damage had already been done. The scars would remain. But the chain that had bound his family, that had turned love into sacrifice and hope into fear, had finally been broken. Marcus didn't look back as he disappeared into the night. He carried no illusions of redemption. Some ghosts would follow him forever, whispering reminders of the brother he had wronged, the blood he had spilled, the innocence he could never reclaim. But for the first time in years, Marcus Carter walked forward without chains around his throat. Not free, but finally unbroken.